For decades, Arabs and Arab Americans have been portrayed in a rather homogenizing Orientalist perspective, whether it be in politics,
of Muslims entering the United States, until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. Americans, these are people that are here.
You know, when I look at Islamic nations, what I see are people who don't give women equal rights.
or in media. Or in other forms of media.
من شمرة بن لادن انت يودع انا ماماش متقاقايا على المحونيات شلي
وانت بورشة؟
ايوه على 9/11
Oh, 9/11, it's the best.
Orientalism dominates the Middle Eastern narrative. For Arabs living in foreign countries, Orientalism is never the biggest of concerns. But for Arab Americans, Orientalism factors out in nearly every aspect of our lives. So we set out to speak to the younger Arab generation to see what it means to them to be American and how they live as both Arabs and Americans. How do you feel that you see America different from the way your parents see it?
When my parents first moved here, they had like some expectations and they sacrificed a lot for me and my siblings to get education. But when I look at it, I feel like I'm more Americanized to think that way because I already get everything that Americans get. So
Older generations of Arab Americans are often more silent about the racism that they experience. How do you feel that your generation stands to be different?
Older generations of Arab Americans are often silent once they experience racism because they feel like they can't really do anything about it. But for me, I feel like if I experience any racism, I would stand up for myself because American culture taught me that I can say how I feel without being persecuted for it.
So I think what we're seeing is somewhat of the American dream at work here. So for example, previous generations, as you said, have been largely silent about the racism that they've experienced because they figured as a first generation American, this is the sort of rite of passage. You have to be quiet. You have to not necessarily question the racism that you face, just accept it and move on. And now we're perhaps in maybe the second or third generation of Arab Americans, and we're feeling, as if our standard of living has been a lot better than what it would have been if we remained in the countries that we've come from. So now we're beginning to open up and question maybe, these are racist attitudes that we're facing on a day-to-day basis. Let's challenge them now. We are established Americans, so now let's set forth and correct those wrongdoings against us.
So I think my parents both came from countries where, it wasn't necessarily okay to talk about the government publicly. And that's something that a lot of Americans don't understand, is that we have the right to outwardly say we don't like what the president is doing or the Congress is doing or our local board of education is doing. So that's something that my parents had to deal with growing up, and even now when they're here, when they experience prejudice, they don't go whining to someone else to complain about it. All they did was work harder. And I think that's something people underestimate. And now in my generation, we recognize that we shouldn't have to work harder. Although we do have to work harder than anyone else because of our names, that shouldn't be the way it is. And our goal now is to make sure that when we work harder, our children won't have to work harder, that they'll have an even playing field. And I think our parents worked the same way, but at that time it was just such a tough hill to climb up that it needs more than just one generation to work towards that.
So when was the first time you ever felt that you were different for being Arab or American, and what was that experience like?
So I think the first time I felt the difference was when I went to kindergarten for the first day. I lived in Long Island, New York, so it was a pretty diverse area, but my parents wanted to take me to a private kindergarten, and the first day, it was orientation, stuff like that, and I remember introducing myself as, "Hi, my name is Mohammed," to the teacher, and this was before 9/11, I'd like to say, so it still wasn't that sentiment, but I still got this sense that I was different.
And at one point in our lives, Arab Americans usually get that talk from their parents of how, you're supposed to align yourself being both Arab and American. How was that talk to you, or how was that experience for you?
Yes, I think that talk was more of a consistent talk. It wasn't just a once in a lifetime thing. My parents consistently told me, remember, you're American, but this is where you come from, is this Arab, heritage that you have. Both my parents, we cooked Arab food. I always ate, let's say, I didn't eat burgers and, American food, like Sloppy Joes or whatever. It was more Arab food consistently. That was one part of my culture. I also had a lot of religion involved in my life with prayer. I never celebrated Christmas. I think that was a big difference in my life. It was different for me to hear about Santa Claus and my parents be like, all right, there's no such thing as a Santa Claus right off the bat. So I think that's where my parents gave a talk, is just by the small differences between American culture and our religion.
Oftentimes, various religious groups and ethnic minority groups in the Middle East are just clumped up as one, as Arab or Middle Eastern. How does that make you feel, being that you're of a religious minority group?
I think it's very interesting, and I don't think a lot of regions in the world have this sort of predicament or dilemma. I think, for one, regardless of whether you're an Arab Christian, a Mizrahi Jewish Arab, or if you're an Arab Muslim, for example, we all tend to share a common political struggle, which is the struggle of, how the standard of living in our countries is generally very destitute compared to other regions in the world. So I think clumping other ethnic groups that live in the Middle East as sort of one kind of makes sense on a political scale, whereas on an ethnic scale, it's not very accurate. Some practices and perhaps Muslim culture don't typically apply to Arab Christian culture, so there's a difference there. But there is definitely underlying political interconnectedness of all ethnicities in the Middle East.
In most surveys in America or applications, Middle Eastern people are often clumped as white. How does that make you feel, or how do you try and go around that?
When I see surveys clumping on Middle Easterns as white, I feel like it's two minorities to be considered one. And on the Rutgers application, white parentheses Middle Easterns such as Egyptians, and I feel like it influences the amount of money we got because we're not considered as minorities.
I think I have no issue with that. Surprisingly, I think, being Caucasian just means, the color of your skin, and I don't think they really classify as different. I think it's, if you want to classify me when I take the SAT as Caucasian, just treat me like a Caucasian later then.
So, oftentimes media portrays being Arab and American as opposites. To what extent is that true in your life?
So I believe that being American and being Arab aren't necessarily polar opposites, but there are characteristics that may work very well together and other characteristics that may repel. So for example, in my life, I grew up on a very strong, perhaps you can call it Protestant work ethic. I think that coincides very nicely with the American ideal of how you can conduct yourself in your daily life. You work hard and you'll be rewarded for it. I think this carries very over nicely from what I've been taught as an Arab American. By contrast, there are other customs that we learn as Arab Americans that may contrast with other Americans' experiences. So for instance, how one deals with a funeral, for example. This is a very random example, but I think it applies. There tends to be a prolonged period of mourning in the life of an Arab American. One dresses up in all black for a very long period of time, and mourns the death and doesn't visit family. And I think in American culture, one accepts this and moves on very quickly.
All right. And do you oftentimes feel that parts of you are more or less Arab and others are more or less American? And how does that various levels of being Arab and American lay out in your life?
So this coincides very nicely with the previous question. So I do believe there are parts of me that are more Arab, whereas others are more American. The more Arab characteristics being hiding one's emotions and going out and working hard in one's life in order to achieve something greater than yourself, whether it be bring honor to your family, bring honor to those in your immediate life. Whereas I also do have some American characteristics as well. I enjoy American media, American movies, American music, more so than I would say Arabic movies or literature, so on.
As an Arab Christian, do you believe that your religion amplifies or minimizes the amount of prejudice you experience living in America?
Religion minimizes the prejudice I experience as Arab American, because when people find out that I am not Muslim, they treat me with like more respect, and like they're not as racist because they find out that I am Christian, and they always see my cross and they make a comment about that.
So contrary to maybe what a Muslim Arab American might feel, I think that being Christian often kind of masks my identity in a way. No one that I've encountered on an initial basis would ever guess that I'm an Arab American, so they're often surprised when I tell them that I am actually from Syria. So in a way, it's probably been positive given the current political atmosphere and given the attitudes towards Muslims Americans. Masking that Arab aspect of my identity has definitely been helpful, but otherwise it's never really played a very significant role in my life.
Recently with the Donald Trump campaign, I personally necessarily haven't been influenced by someone coming up to me and calling me terrorist. You know, that's happened many times in my life where I've been called terrorist, I've been called, you know, a sand lover, a lot of different things, and it's understandable, but I think it was with my sister when she came up to me, and she's 14, and she told me, you know, I'm not sure if I want to wear hijab because I don't know if I'm going to be safe. And that's not something I want my little sister to fear when she's trying to make a decision about her own religion. She shouldn't have to fear safety. She shouldn't have to fear prejudice. She should just have to fear, you know, her Lord. And that's what I believe, and that's what affected me the most, is throughout this election, this rhetoric has brought out a certain type of hate that has brought fear into other people. So it's brought out hate from others and brought in fear through minorities.
And since you've brought it up, Donald Trump will be taking office starting January. What are your main concerns for Arab Americans under his reign?
Oh, I hope that he unifies the country. I think that's the most important thing, is that's it. We can't, there's no way, nothing that we can do now that's gonna take away his spot. He's the president-elect. I think what we need to focus on is making sure his administration is focused on unifying, you know, American citizens and bringing us together, and understanding that just because my parents immigrated here from another country does not make them less of an American citizen as they are. And that, as long as that's their goal of the administration, and they focus on, you know, solutions to economic issues, healthcare issues, the same issues that we all have to deal with, I think that'll be the best for us.
All right. Trump has said quite controversial things about Muslims, more like the ban on Muslims that he brought up, and even more controversial was his vice president Mike Pence's comments about how he wanted to impose this Muslim ID. How does that make you feel? And if that were to actually take place, what would you do?
I think I'd sign on to the registry, I'd take the ID, you know, I'd do whatever needs to be done if the American government really believes that, because there's nothing to hide. But at the same time, I want Donald Trump and Mike Pence to meet Muslims and say, and really understand what our religion's about, because if they do, I guarantee you they won't understand what their own actions are stating.
So for people sometimes when they make a broad brush statement against Arab Muslims or Muslim Arabs, I think it definitely is on some level an attack on Arab Christians, for example, because those people tend not to know the difference between the different varying ethnic groups in the Middle East. So for that sake, I think, yeah, perhaps it is some sort of assault maybe on other ethnic groups. So I definitely do feel some sense of antagonism whenever someone brings up Muslim Arabs as identifying or being part of a certain culture, or having certain practices, or so on and so forth. So yeah.
While the Arab American narrative might be quite invisible, it's important that we realize that, just like with other minority groups, America may be repeating its cycle of prejudice. On a more important note, it's important that we recognize that expressing your outrage against inequalities through Black Lives Matters or feminism does not make you any less American. It makes you more American because you fight for what it stands for.